I'm going to try to talk about typical development and how development can go wrong in children with autism. As an overview, I did prepare a little bit more generally about the kinds of things that developmental psychologists are interested in knowing in general. And then telling you a little bit about autism and how development can go wrong. So what is autism and what goes wrong in children with autism's development? And what can autism help us understand about typical development? And to help you understand a little bit about how we can figure things out from studying children with autism, I'm going to talk to you about some of the more provocative theories about what causes autism. And then what these theories have contributed and what we still need to know. Okay, so in general, and I think I speak for my colleagues, but they can disagree with me, developmental psychologists are interested in the study of development because we want to make sense of things that change and at the same time are stable. So we're looking at stability over time, but also changes over time. So for example, how is this baby or this child then become this adult? Is it the same person? Probably yes. But how can it be that this baby who is so helpless is now this adult that is so competent? So it's quite this paradox of change and stability. We also want to know a little bit about which theories are supported and are better able to account for development. So, if we had a theory about babies are from Mars and adolescents are from Venus, how do we support this theory? We need some data to look at whether one theory works and the other doesn't. We also want to know which methods are more or less useful to study developmental psychology. So for example, does interviewing a baby make sense? Probably not. You're not going to get a lot of data there. And evidence against false claims is really important. So for example, if somebody says, well, I know that babies can speak before they crawl, well, someone can study babies and look at their development and observe and see that actually they crawl before they speak, right? Another important reason we want to study development is because there have been a lot of popular myths out there about children and what children are all about. And actually, years ago, we used to think that children were like miniature adults, and we used to treat children like little adults. And we know today that that's not the case. I think we also want to study and know about developmental development because it concerns us all. We've all experienced development, and we can also observe development in others, like our children in particular. And so I guess we might assume that we know a lot or that we're experts in development, but really I think the idea that humans know development like fish know water is really important because we may think we know because we've been through it or we can observe it, but actually it's all around us and we're too close to it, and often we're biased. We think we actually know what's happening, but we don't. So this is why we need scientific methods to really try to avoid those personal biases that we have about our own personal experience or oversights that we might have. So I'll give you an example. If we didn't have a developmental perspective, we would run into problems. So we might, for example, assume that we see a behavior in children and it means the same thing as a similar behavior in adults. So here's a child having a temper tantrum. Now, is it possible that this temper tantrum in a child is the same as an adult's temper outburst? Some may argue yes. This very famous, I think most of you recognize this, is probably the most famous part of the soccer World Cup, right? The World Series, where one of the players headbutted another player and it became, headline news. So it's possible that temper in adults is similar to temper in children, but it's also possible that they're very different phenomena. Here's another example. We have an adult who has lost speech due to a brain injury sustained as a result of a motorcycle accident. So this is an adult with a fully developed brain and has had an accident and now can no longer speak. And we compare that with a child with autism who doesn't speak from birth, right, from early childhood. The behavior appears similar, that there's no speech. However, the underlying processes involved are very different. Okay, so we need to take a developmental perspective in order to understand the causes of that very similar behavior. Okay, so autism is probably the developmental disorder that seems to affect all aspects of development. And in some ways, I guess we can learn the most from autism about typical development, because everything seems to go wrong in autism. So it's considered a neurobiological disorder that lasts throughout a person's lifetime. There's really no cure at this point. It's part of a group of disorders known as autism spectrum disorders, or also known as pervasive developmental disorders. It seems to run in families, so where there is one child, there may be more, and may involve a whole system of genes. So detecting one gene might not actually solve the problem of autism. You might have to find a whole system of genes that are involved. According to the latest CDC reports, there's about 1 in 150 children who are diagnosed with autism. And this is now, some people are calling it an epidemic. It's more common than cancer, diabetes, and AIDS combined. So it's quite a serious problem in children. It occurs in all racial, ethnic, and cultural groups, and it's 4 times more likely to occur in boys than in girls, and we don't know why yet. It's still a mystery. And it affects all aspects of development: social development, emotional development, behavioral development, and even physical development. So some of the behaviors you might see in a child with autism are, for example, a lack of understanding of what is dangerous. So a lack of understanding of fearful. So probably the opposite of what Arlene's Wimberly is like. This child would sort of run into the street and not think twice. Children with autism also have a delay in language, so they tend not to speak at the appropriate time in development, usually around 1 or 2 years. They sometimes will develop speech, and sometimes they won't develop speech at all. When they do develop speech, it tends to happen at around 5 years, so they start really late. And those that do develop language, they develop language, but it seems quite inappropriate or odd. So they may talk like a tape recording or a parrot, or they tend to repeat something you've said, or repeat the same thing over and over again, or repeat something that they've heard on TV. They tend to spend a lot of time doing repetitive things, so playing with toys in a way that is not typical. So instead of taking a car and making a car noise and running the car around a particular street track, they may just take the car and spin the wheel on the car over and over again. So a very sort of lack of imagination and creativity in play. They also have a great deal of difficulty interacting with other people, including their parents. So you might see a child with autism who doesn't even look at their parents when their parents are trying to get their attention, or they might start screaming or yelling if they need or want something as opposed to pointing at something. So they're very difficult to read, and parents often have to guess what's going on or what the child needs. Now, I recently read a book called Not Even Wrong. It's written by a novelist and also a father of a child with autism, Paul Collins. And he writes this novel about his son who was diagnosed with autism. And he says something really interesting in the book. He says, "To know autism is to know the mystery of what it means to be human." And the reason he says this is because while he was researching for his latest novel, he was looking into the story of Wild Peter. And this is a story of a feral child who was found wandering in the forest in Germany. And he was found wandering, not having had any contact with humans for over a year. And he begins, so the novelist begins to draw parallels between this wild boy who was found wandering and his son with autism. So he could see parallels in their behavior. And he seemed to think that somehow this feral child had autistic behaviors, just like his son. And actually this idea of feral children, Wild Peter wasn't the first child to be found wandering alone in the forest. A long time ago, at the end of the 18th century, about, I think it was 1799, actually, the exact year, this Victor of Aveyron was found, and he was captured and subsequently escaped, and then was captured again in the 1800s. And again, he was found in the south of France, wandering in the forest. And he was about 12 when they found him again. And he couldn't speak, and he had lots of scars, and he was very weathered. Looked like he'd been on his own for probably the beginning of his life. And there were all kinds of wild stories about how he got there, how he survived, he was raised by wolves, etc. They really didn't know what had happened. But what was interesting is that this discovery of Victor happened around the time of the Age of Enlightenment, where scientists were talking about what separated humans from animals. You know, how do we, because we are an animal, but we are different from other animals. And he was the ideal experiment in nature, right? Here's a baby that probably was abandoned and then had to fend for itself like an animal. And here's a quote from the Society of the Observers of Man regarding the so-called wild boy of Aveyron. And it says, in 40 years, this boy learned to write 2 words. This was in French, in France. He wrote lait, which is milk, and au Dieu, which is God. And the former, lait, referring to milk, being a kind of cry for anything he wanted. So that's all the language he was able to learn. And so people were wondering, is it possible that this child was autistic and actually didn't really have the capacity to learn language? So the theory was that maybe his parents had abandoned him because he was a very different child and he had problems with his behavior or his skills, and they had abandoned him and he could possibly have had autism. However, this is really just conjecture. It's just sort of people thinking about what might have happened, but there's no real evidence to suggest that feral children and children with autism are alike. So even today, we don't necessarily believe that that's the case. But what's interesting about this line of thinking is that it helps us to think about the role of social development for children. What does it actually do? What do we need in order to develop as normal human beings? So we know that a deprived social environment has a devastating impact on the human brain, but does that make one not human? That was the question. And this professor, a language and communication professor from City University in London, said that part of being human is being brought up by humans, and that if you're not brought up by humans, are you completely human? So he's asking this question. Now, we currently accept the notion that we are human because we have a genetic lineage that makes us human, right? As opposed to other primates, for example. But from a psychological perspective, being human means something more than just our genes. So being human means also how we're raised and how we relate to others. And one of the theories that has come out of all this talk of what's human and what's not human or what's other animal is a theory called the theory of mind. And this was a theory that was proposed to distinguish humans from other animals, that it seems to be the one really unique thing that humans can do that other animals don't do. And so a theory of mind refers to the ability to understand that others have different minds, including different thoughts, different feelings, different beliefs about the world. And although some primitive forms of understanding are present in certain animals, mostly socialized animals, and primates, which are closest to us. So even animals that are highly socialized, like dogs, for example, may have some precursory form of theory of mind or understanding of others, but it really is believed at this point, through all the research that's been done, that humans are the only species that have a sophisticated ability to understand this subjectivity and relate to others accordingly. So knowing how to predict other people's behavior, how to try to understand other people's emotions, how to have empathy. Now, children with autism have difficulty understanding other people's minds. And some people have talked about that being a core problem, like a cause of autism. But more recently, some of the research has shown that actually that may not be a cause of autism. It might just be a consequence of not being able to take advantage of social learning opportunities through language and parent-child interactions. So it's not that these children don't actually have an ability or the potential to learn that other people are different or have different perspectives on the world. It's that these children aren't able to engage in the learning environment that is required to develop this ability. Now, so those are some of the earlier sort of theories about autism. More recently, there have been other ideas about what causes autism or what autism is, and this has sort of gone to the other end of the pendulum, and now there are some researchers saying that children with autism are actually like superhuman in some ways, that they have abilities that far surpass most human potential. So for example, there's a group of researchers in Montreal, led by Dr. Laurent Mautron, that have been doing some studies and finding that children and adults with autism can do some tasks without the least bit of effort when it takes us a lot of effort to do. So for example, his research group has looked at Savant Skills. So things like, if you've seen The Rain Man, you remember how he was able to calculate things in a sort of split second, and or people that can actually tell you what day you were born, like the day of the week that you were born, if you just tell them when you were born, the year that you were born and the month. Also other savant skills that are really impossible for most of us to accomplish. And even some would argue, even if we practice and took a lot of our time to try to become experts at these things, we might not be able to do it. Now, Dr. Mautron's group believe, and why I say superhuman, is because his group really believes that these individuals with autism are so different from us that they're qualitatively different. They actually have different brains, and that you shouldn't compare people with autism with people who don't have autism, and that it's not a fair comparison, and that their abilities and their intelligence needs to be studied in its own right and not considered better or worse than ours. It's just different. So here are some examples from his research findings, and mostly where people with autism are superior in their performance is in the visual perceptual domain. So he's found, his group has found that discrimination of information in primary auditory areas is superior. So things like pitch discrimination. Many people with autism can actually have perfect pitch and can tune an instrument perfectly, and without ever being taught or without having any practice whatsoever. So they have this ability to discriminate pitch. Another line of research is a discrimination of first order gradings. So the idea that they can discriminate orientation. Okay, so if you show them this image and then part of the image is oriented differently, they can pick that up very quickly where it would take us longer to do. Another example is visual spatial tasks. This comes from, well, it's sort of a part of an IQ test that we do more generally for all children. And what it is you got to try to pick out the feature that is different among a bunch of distractors. And apparently people with autism are able to do it in under really difficult conditions where the distractors are so similar to the target that it's really hard for us to pick that up. But people with autism are able to see that just tiny little difference really quickly. And here's another example of when you're putting a puzzle together, if you have the whole puzzle complete, and you have to figure out what the parts are, it's really hard to do. But if you separate the parts, or you can see the definition of the parts, then it's easier. Well, people with autism, it doesn't matter if you separate the parts. They seem to separate the parts on their own, and they can do a puzzle really easily, or figure out what the individual parts are really easily. Whereas for us, it would be very difficult. So that's another idea about autism, that autism may be a really sort of high-level perceptual refinement that takes these individuals in a particular trajectory of development that is different from ours. So they tend to see the world very differently because of the way that they pay attention to things, the way they visually and spatially can manipulate things. Now, there are other ideas about what autism is. More recently, autism has been thought to be not different from the norm, but just an extreme form of the norm. And this comes from a researcher in the UK from Cambridge University, Dr. Simon Baron-Cohen, and he's developed this theory of autism which talks about autism being an extreme form of the male brain. And the idea here is that, for example, women, on average, are better at identifying and responding to the thoughts and actions of other people. And in psychology, we call this empathizing. So being able to understand the other person's perspective and responding in an emotionally congruent way. So for example, you know, after hanging up the telephone with someone, you might say, well, maybe she didn't phone me because she was feeling hurt by my comment. So really thinking about the reasons why someone else is acting the way they do, feeling the way they are. So women tend to be a little bit better at empathizing. And men, on average, are better at building systems from parts and at understanding systems. So things like putting mechanical parts together, building things like children who may build things with Lego parts and so on, car engines, weather patterns, so things that have a system, mostly a closed system, that you can manipulate the various parts and figure things out. And what Dr. Simon Baron-Cohen says is that people with autism are superior systematizers, but poor empathizers. Okay, so his idea is that they're actually better than most men at systematizing, okay, and very poor at empathizing. Oh. Now, let's try a little experiment right here, okay? I want you, if you can, take notes of what you get right and wrong, okay? So one of the tasks that he uses to figure out whether people are good empathizers or poor empathizers is reading people's eyes. So if you can read what someone is thinking or feeling by looking at their eyes, then you're probably a very good empathizer. So if we look at this person's eyes and look at at the top, you see the bar that has the various emotions. What would you say, and don't say it out loud, just write it down, that this person is conveying from their eyes? Is it joking, flustered, desire, or convinced? Okay, so make a note of that. I'll show you the answer is desire. Okay, let's try another one. What about these eyes? Are they irritated, sarcastic, friendly, or worried? Okay, so write that down. you can see they're not easy. They're really not easy. Now these eyes, are they apologetic, friendly, dispirited, or uneasy? Okay, keep that in mind. And the answer is uneasy. Okay. What about these eyes? Despondent, excited, shy, or relieved? Okay, ready for the answer? Despondent. Okay, so just from the women, how many women got most of them right? Wow. Great. Okay, how many men got most of them right? Very good. See, his data is accurate. So, oh, I forgot one. That's okay. So he's done really large-scale studies on this and tested many, many, many women and many, many men, mostly university participants. But what he's found is that that men do significantly worse than women on this task, and that people with autism do significantly worse than men. So you have women, you have men, and then you have people with autism. So that there is actually a really, in some ways, a really good support for his idea that women are better at reading these kinds of emotional cues. Now, he's also done, here on this side, you see a graph on systematizing scores, and I don't have an example to give you of that, but I can give you an idea of the kind of task it is. It's really kind of figuring out the orientation of objects in space, more sort of mechanically oriented tasks that where you have to figure out how one pattern then leads to another pattern with no social information at all needed to complete the task. And when you do that kind of task, you get the complete opposite effects. You get females doing less well than males, and people with autism doing, whether they're female or male, doing much better than males as a group, okay? So if you want to know more about this kind of research, he has a book out called The Essential Difference, where he talks about the extreme male brain theory of autism. It's very provocative, not necessarily, the truth. I mean, I think it's just a theory at this point that he has some data collected about it, which is supporting his theory, but still has helped us to think about these ideas and how they relate to people with autism, and what they might be telling us about normal development of empathy in women and men. So we really don't yet know what causes autism, but all of these ideas that have been generated about autism have really helped us to ask more questions and spark debate about what is the essential or essential things that are needed for a child to develop into a socially competent adult. So one of the more basic questions is, what does it mean to be human from a psychological perspective? What kind of abilities and environments are needed to foster development that really help us to be fully competent human beings in society? And which abilities are needed to develop into a socially competent individual that can navigate the social world, because we are social animals and we need to cooperate and live together. And so that becomes a really important thing. And if we don't know or benefit from social activity, then we're at a real disadvantage. The other question, something that I ask in my research, is how is cognitive development, so this idea of the superior perceptual abilities or cognitive abilities, how is that related to social development? Are they completely separate things, or are they related in some way? So is there a relationship between how we think about objects in the world and how we think about people in the world? Or are those two completely different things? So one question that people are beginning to ask is, are there different forms of intelligence? Social and then non-social intelligence. And maybe people with autism are highly intelligent when it comes to non-social things, but they're very lacking in intelligence when it comes to social things. So we don't know the answer yet, but it certainly helps us to think about these ideas. And then finally, how do we deal with individual differences and diversity if in fact people with autism are really so different, and then not just people with autism, but other groups of people that have various other types of abilities and disabilities? How do we include all these children in our social systems, school, community, and society? Because really these social systems are set up for the norm generally, and it's hard when people don't quite fit into the norm. So it really challenges us to think about how to include all these individuals with all of their differences. And then I guess we're left like Charlie Brown saying, good grief, how can something simple behavior be so complex? And I'll leave it at that.
I was just wondering, when you're talking about systems and empathy and researching that kind of stuff, are gender roles and socialization taken into account?
In terms of developing empathy?
Yeah, just like, typical, stereotypical girl develops empathy because she's taken on the nurturing role, or a male develops the kind of systematic brain to, take on male typical role. Kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, like most answers in psychology, it's there's never a straight answer. So it's not yes or no, but it's yes in part. So socialization plays a part of it, but there's certainly lots of other things going on. And Arlene mentioned that from birth we can see differences in children's temperament. Well, even from birth we can see differences in terms of children, the sexes of the children, right, and how they play. So really early on, there may be some hormonal differences and other things that have affected the brain of these children that are leading to a certain tendency towards certain things, right? So boys might tend to look at trucks and cars and more male sort of gender typical toys, and girls may be more attracted to more female gender typical toys, even really early on. But that doesn't mean that they're not influenced by the people who interact with them, like their parents, right? They did a really fascinating study with infants. What they did was they put a child who was a boy, they put that child in a blue little sleeper, and put him on a couch, and then had people come in and interact with that child. And when the child was dressed in blue, even the women, actually women more than men, would treat that boy, oh, what a tough little boy, oh, you're going to be a fireman when you grow up. And we're doing all these male sort of interaction type behaviors with this baby, thinking it was a boy. And then they took the same exact baby and put it in a pink sleeper, and people would come in and treat it very gently and daintily and, you know, say, oh, what a lovely little girl, and you'll be a princess, you'll be, you know, a ballerina. And it was the same exact thing. So there's lots of, so there is some, you know, some hormonal differences prenatally. There are things that happen really early on. The temperaments might be different, and the way parents react to the child is different. So all of those factors play into whether a child will be more empathic or more of a systemizer, right?
Yeah, you bring up prenatal development, and I want to ask a question that may sound a bit off base. Are there autistic mice? Are there autistic lab rats that could be used? Because it seems to me that a lot of what happens in the womb determines whether a child is autistic or not. And if there's autistic mice, then the variables would be easier to get a handle on.
Yeah, they are trying to develop a mice model of autism. You can imagine it's not easy because it's not just one gene, right? And we actually don't know what the genes are. But they have been trying, and they have found actually some behaviors in monkeys, not mice, that are autistic-like when they lesion a certain part of the brain. But I have to be a bit suspicious of that kind of reasoning, because when you lesion a part of the brain, it's sort of like that example I gave where the adult who had a motorcycle accident and then has brain injury is very different than a child who's born with a particular type of disorder and develops over time, right? If you're lesioning something, it's a brain that's already developed, or even if it's, you know, you lesion it at birth, it's a different thing that is happening to that brain than a brain that was born that way. Do you see what I'm saying? But it is, they are trying to develop these animal models and hoping to find out a little bit more about what causes autism.
Last question, right here.
Okay. Through my school, I volunteer for a kid with autism during lunchtime, like watching over him, because there's a legal binding contract that he can't be alone at any time. So he has a problem with like touching people inappropriately if he is left alone, but if there's like an adult figure there, then he won't do that. But like, how do you deal with this except like watching the kid consistently?
Can I send you the bill at the no, I get that's a really complicated question. I'd have to know a little bit about what's the motivating that behavior. So why is he touching people? So what's he getting out of touching people, and where is he touching people? You know, a little bit more about the functional aspect of the behavior. Do you get any support at the school for?
Oh yeah. It's like just through someone I know, like one of the teachers that I'm really close with. I help her like through my peer counseling program, and it's just pretty much like you just sit with the kid, and at lunchtime, like while they eat their lunch and everything.
And he doesn't touch.
He doesn't. It's like other people. Like for example, like one time he was walking ahead of me down the hallway, and he just randomly touched someone on the bum, and like the person that I'm working with, the teacher, she says that he does this all the time. Like when he's not with someone who's personified as an authority figure, that he'll do this. Mm-hmm. So I'm just like wondering like what causes that and everything like that.
Yeah. No, I've always envied people or children with autism and adults with autism, because they actually say what they think exactly and they do what they want exactly. So they don't have the kind of social, you know, constraints that we do. And in some ways that kind of frees them up to do pretty much anything, you know, unless, you know, you kind of have to explain why that's inappropriate, or, you know, maybe something else that they can do that gives them the same kind of pleasure as opposed to that which is inappropriate. Is he verbal? Can he speak?
Yeah, oh yeah.
He's very verbal? Okay. Because sometimes kids who are not verbal are just not able to explain why that behavior is so interesting or what they're getting out of it. And it's just a kind of a way of expressing whatever they're thinking or feeling in a physical way as opposed to telling you something. But if he's verbal, you can have a conversation with him and figure out, you know, what's motivating about that and try to redirect him to be motivated about something else.
Thanks for coming. Look forward to seeing you.